going to talk to you about pipelines, of which we have many underway in Pennsylvania at the moment. My pipeline examples will be drawn from various places around the state. I shall be talking mostly about the Mariner East 2, which is a Sunoco pipeline. I have a little bit to say about, and some examples from the Leidy pipeline up in the Poconos, in the Delaware River Basin. I don't want to confine my remarks strictly to any one pipeline, though I would say, from having worked on several, that the concerns I will express are characteristic of all that I have looked at. I am a consulting ecologist. I have been assessing environmental impacts for about 50 years and never expected to be in the consulting business. I was very much an academic and was offered a job early in the years of environmental regulation and have stayed with it ever since, with my own firm since 1980. The key statement that I gave you in my abstract today was that the resources present along pipeline corridors are supposed to be identified by applicants and reviewed by regulatory agencies on behalf of the public prior to permit approvals in order to minimize unnecessary damage. In practice, however, the results of permit review too often fail to achieve the environmental protection promised by the rhetoric of our statutes, regulations, and technical guidance documents. So that's the essence of what I have to say today. The way I will structure my presentation is to give you a few facts and figures based on examining several pipelines and the kinds of things I'm finding. This is work that has been done on behalf of several clients, including the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, the Clean Water Action people, landowners, and others. I have not been working directly for the pipeline people. I've done an awful lot of permit application work for people wanting to build things for many decades. But I look at things both from the point of view of the applicant who wants to construct some kind of facilities, from the point of view of conservation groups and homeowners who may be opposing specific projects, and sometimes directly for the regulatory agencies themselves. So wetlands is a relatively controversial field. I try, whoever my client is, to be very accurate in applying the relevant methodology and getting the information right. I've got about 3 or 4 points which I will be illustrating in graphically as I go through in a few minutes, but let me just comment on these briefly. Wetlands, the location of wetlands and of many streams is not known in general. Yes, there are national wetland inventory maps, but they don't tell us very much. They tell us where some of the larger wetlands are in Pennsylvania. Most ponds, but not all, are shown on national wetland inventory maps. But it is not possible to do a thorough and credible job of inventorying wetlands using only high altitude aerial photographs, which is how the National Wetland Inventory maps are produced. Even if you're using false color infrared, where wetness gets a little bit of extra return on the signatures. So it's necessary to go out and look in the field on any construction site as part of the planning for the project to find out where the wetlands are and where the streams are. Many streams are shown on USGS topographic maps, or the modern version, the National Hydrographic Atlas, which is available online. But headwater streams are often left off those data sources, so that when you actually look in the field, there may be a lot more streams than are known on published maps, as well as wetlands. Pipeline sponsors are promoting large projects. Presumably their consultants are going quickly along the pipeline right of way to inventory large areas in short periods of time. And unfortunately, the agencies have no staff nor budget to go out and field check the resulting delineations. So we have done some of that for our clients. We are limited to where we can go and look because we don't have the access to private land across the Commonwealth. We have looked at wetland delineations for pipelines in state parks, state forests, state game lands, other park facilities and public facilities, road crossings, and such ways of getting access rather than going out into individual people's property. So we only have the ability to spot check in a few places, and I'll tell you some of the results of that. The pipeline companies, like any applicants for permits to place obstructions and encroachments into wetlands, are expected, first off, to find out where the wetlands are. Secondly, to find out how to avoid encroachments into those wetlands to the extent possible, and to consider alternatives, and then for the unavoidable impacts to mitigate them. If the inventory is not done right in the first place, the system cannot work properly. And we heard about in the plenary this morning something about the loss of forests throughout the Schuylkill watershed in the Delaware River Basin. That's happening around the state as a whole. And so I think I will give you some examples of exactly the problem, because for pipelines, a focus is on forested wetlands even more than on other kinds of wetlands. In general, on the pipelines, wetlands, of course, occupy a small percentage of the landscape in Pennsylvania. It's only less than 5%. The reported figures from NWI are more like 2% of the landscape. So lots of uplands in the state are forested. And there are no requirements for replacement of any of that forest on the corridors that the pipeline companies cut. When they go through a wetland, they're supposed to put the wetland back. They're also supposed to properly characterize the wetlands and minimize their impacts. Now, the minimization ordinarily consists of narrowing the corridor, and you will see that, the construction disturbance corridor. You will see that on my illustrations coming up. They normally take a 50-foot wide permanent disturbance corridor that's 50 feet from one side of the pipeline to the other, so it's roughly 25 feet either side. They often will co-locate alongside existing pipelines, and that's a general practice for minimizing impacts of most kinds. And yes, it's better to build a new pipeline alongside an old pipeline, except that that doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because the new pipeline is not built right on top of the old pipeline. It has to have another 50 feet next to it. And wherever the pipelines go through the forest, and there's a 50-foot wide corridor, they're now, with the new pipeline, will be a 100-foot wide corridor. And of course, some of that will be, most of that will be upland forest, but some of it will be wetland, yeah.
You can't do the 25-foot as a common border.
Yeah, border in the center.
Yeah.
Well, to some extent, it varies topographically in detail, but I'm giving a broad brush picture of the pipeline company's supposed to squish the right-of-way and make it narrower when they come to a stream crossing or a wetland crossing. And sometimes they do that, and you'll see examples of that. The results add up, because the Mariner 2 East pipeline, for example, is supposed to extend about 306 miles from Washington County to Delaware County. It's across the southern part of Pennsylvania. Within that corridor, Sunoco has identified 562 wetlands to be crossed by the pipeline and 884 streams to be crossed. Almost 3/4 of the wetlands are to be crossed by digging a ditch, putting the pipe in, and then backfilling the ditch and replacing the wetlands on top. Almost 1/4 will be crossed by proposed borings underground, and a boring is not supposed to disturb the surface, so that in the first instance would be thought to be better for the wetlands and the roads and the railroads and whatever else is being gone underneath. If you happen to be a homeowner nearby and you have a private well, that may not be so good for you, because that boring may upset your water quality, and there's been a lot of concern for that in recent months, which has been in the press very much. In this 300 miles of pipeline, Sunoco acknowledges that it will disturb 36.7 acres of wetlands. That's about 1/10 of an acre of wetlands per linear mile of pipeline. That's their numbers. They claim that they will have no net loss of wetland acreage, because they're going to put all the wetlands back to wetlands after they've built their pipeline. Now, for the last 25 years or so, there have been a number of people out looking at the success of wetland restoration mitigation, and the record is not very good. So I don't know how much of that will ever get restored. There is increasingly a fair bit of monitoring required for several years and reporting. Historically, in Pennsylvania, those monitoring requirements have been largely ignored. The agencies devote no staff resources, whether it be the Corps of Engineers or the Department of Environmental Protection, to looking to see whether they've ever received reports, much less whether anything ever happened in the field to actually accomplish mitigation. In the pipeline projects, I suspect there will be a little bit of investigation to see what is done in the way of mitigation. So 36.7 acres of wetlands to be affected and restored, no net loss. Within that 36 acres, part of that is forested wetlands. Forested wetlands get extra attention because the state regulators have determined that forested wetlands have additional values over and above those of herbaceous or scrub wetlands. And the forest on top of the pipeline is not to be restored by the pipeline companies. That's a permanent conversion to open ground, whether it be upland forest or wetland forest. So within the 36 acres or 36.7 acres of wetlands, Sunoco acknowledges 4/10 of 1 acre of forest that will be permanently converted from forested wetland to herbaceous wetland. And so to mitigate for that, they are proposing to plant some trees in existing wetlands out in central Pennsylvania on a site. I have not seen any of the details of the proposed mitigation plan. I'm not terribly impressed by it. So that is my general introduction here. I would just say that even if, with regard to mitigation, even if all of the work is done properly to replace the soil, replace the hydrology, and get some vegetation back in the wetlands, it will be a long time before the soil conditions return to the pre-construction shape, and so the biogeochemistry is not going to be there to denitrify excess nitrates and perform other water purification functions for some years, even if the vegetation comes back relatively quickly. And the non-forested corridors, of course, will become open areas, which are great for edge-loving species. The deer and the cowbirds will like that, but the warblers don't, that want interior forest. Okay, let's look at some graphics and see what we found when we went out and started looking around and see what happens. There. Oh, okay, here's the Mariner East pipeline. This is an intrastate pipeline. It is not an interstate pipeline, so it avoids federal regulation, even though it starts in Ohio and goes down to Pennsylvania and Delaware and comes through some of West Virginia on the way. So that's the 300 miles. There it is.
Yeah, you have to double tap.
Twice, okay, magic thing, okay. Well, here's the kind of thing we found. This happens to be from Perry County, which is relatively far west. This is not too far from Altoona when you get out that way. This is high in the landscape. We've got a mountain that's sloping this way. This is a piece of the Tiondaga State Forest, so we could get into this land. And this is the proposed pipeline here. Now, you will see that it's wider here, but at this point it pinches down to be a narrower construction corridor. Well, that's because this is the wetland. This brick-like pattern is supposed to be a scrub wetland with shrubs. This gray-toned wetland is supposed to be a palustrin emergent, that is a herbaceous wetland without trees and shrubs. There is an existing gas line here, which is shown right there. Is shown right here, coming right along here, and that's an open area because it's been cut for years and is kept open. They're going to build a new pipeline just to the north of it. If I go to the next thing, I'll give you a blow up of this area. Now, okay, here's the existing gas pipeline coming across here. Here are the two new proposed pipelines. This is a plank, a series of mats so that the equipment can go back and forth across this wetland. Note right here, it's very hard to see, there's a tree line right here, which is right along the edge of the existing pipeline, right where you'd expect it. everything that way is forest. They are affecting, according to Sunoco, no forest here. This is all palustrine wetland. Over here, that's right. This is not treed, and right along the gas pipe existing, it's not treed. But everything from that forest line, which is drawn by their engineers on their ENS plan drawing, is a forest. This is a miscount of forest. The actual boundaries of this wetland are not bad. I mean, the wetland continues to the north. That's outside their study corridor. But the limits were about right here, but the wetland is mischaracterized. If we look to the south down that wetland, here's the existing pipeline. Here, right in the foreground, is this palustrine wetland. And this is the forest that starts, boom, right there. And close to where this man is standing, here I am standing. The picture is taken from the gas pipeline, looking straight to the north, and as far as you can see, it's forest. This is not a palustrine wetland. Now, when I'm getting ready to do a lecture on how you determine what is a forest and what is a palustrine wetland, and there are rules for all that under the coordinate classification that the Fish and Wildlife Service put out 40 years ago, and it was republished a couple of years ago. Also, there are rules for determining wetlands, which are very specific to the Army Corps of Engineers in the '87 manual and the recent supplements, regional supplements. Those are two very different sets of methodologies. They were produced by different agencies for different purposes. The Corps nowadays asks for the coordinate classification of the wetlands, but the Corps doesn't tell you how to use it. And so this, I would suggest, is a gross misuse of that. On the methodology side. Let's go on and see what else. Okay, we were just looking at this wetland. This is the scrub wetland. This is the palustrine wetland. If we go just down the road, go down the hill, there's a road here, and there's a stream over in here. Look this way, and if you look right in here, this is also a palustrine wetland, according to Sunoco, and it's not right. Here is that same area. Here's this scrub wetland up here. This is all palustrine. This is forest. And they've just undermapped the forested wetland and called it herbaceous. Well, that's to the benefit of their client because you don't have to do any off-site mitigation for the forest. Now, I guess that's just what we were looking at right there. And once again, you can see the tree line right here in the middle of the construction. I mean, they're not really building the pipeline over here because that's an existing gas line. They're building it to the north. Here's another example, another palustrine wetland right here, which is in Indiana County. These are elevations that have been put in on the aerial photograph by Sunoco. This is labeled PEM, emergent wetland. I draw your attention to the shadows of the tree trunks. This is a leaf-off picture. Those shadows go right up into that wetland. And again, here's the existing pipeline. Obvious open area here. But this, where the construction is all forested. That's listed and tallied as a palustrine wetland. Here's another kind of problem. This is less frequent in the examples that I have seen looking along this pipeline. This is an example in the Tuscarora State Forest of actual mist wetlands. These purple wetlands were identified by Sunoco in their application. This darker purple is a forested wetland. All the rest of this they've called palustrin. Once again, same point that I've been making, this is palustrin along this existing pipeline. But up here where they're doing the construction, it's all densely forested. They missed this one entirely. This is a wetland. They got that one, they missed this one. But they pretty much got the wetlands identified here. These happen to be high quality streams, so these wetlands are all of exceptional value except for those two. Those are far enough away from the stream that they won't be, but the purple ones and this one would all be EV wetlands. And they don't get any replacement as forest or any consideration as forest. Here's what it looks like. I'm standing just inside the forest from the pipeline, existing pipeline right of way, which is going like that. That's what it looks like. And if you turn around the other way and look into the thing from the edge up by the pipeline, I mean, this is very much a forest. Now, this is a small wetland. But small wetlands are characteristic in Pennsylvania. The absolute number of acres is not all that great, but it's greater than has been acknowledged. This is the one up higher on the landscape. They missed this one entirely. Of course, this is wintertime, so we don't have all the vegetation to report there. Okay, here's another one, another example of the same thing. PEM here, again, trees, leaf on in this part of the photograph. You can see the trees here, the crowns of the trees where in the construction right away. Now, I'm going to shift geographically to Delaware County, much closer by. Some of you may know where the Franklin Mint is on US 1. The Franklin Mint on this little map would be right about here. US 1 is right here. This is Valley Road. The old Wawa Dairy building is here. And Wawa has donated some land in here that's shown in green for a little piece of parkland so we could get in and look at this. There's a retirement home here. The old Mariner 1 pipeline went down US 1 to Valley Road and came up Valley Road. Mariner 2, they decided they didn't want to do that, so they're coming right along the edge of this retirement facility. And I would not particularly want somebody that I knew living in that when they pulled this pipeline right here. From this point on, the pipeline is to be underground for a long stretch. That's one of these horizontal directional drilling areas of pipeline. The rest of this was all trench and backfill. This is called Rocky Run. This is really one stream. That's photos that are not exactly rectified. Rocky Run is a high quality tributary stream that goes into Chester Creek. And so the problem here is right in there. Now they're showing this big green area as wetland. And they're characterizing it. Here's an aerial photograph, exactly the same area. Again, here's Rocky Run, here's the pipeline, there's the horizontal bore, and the stream comes here, and this is the wetland that they're cutting with the open trench. Now, according to Sunoco, they're also cutting this piece of wetland. In this instance, I would not agree that this is a wetland. This has bright brown soil and cherry trees and would never qualify as a wetland. But this is a wetland, and they call it palustrin. Let me show you what it looks like. Here's the ENS plan drawing. Again, here is Rocky Run, these little dashed lines that go up like that. Here is their wetland that comes through here. They are calling it, again, a PEM, which is an herbaceous wetland, and they're going to be digging into it right here. And then I took that same drawing and I just colored in the forest in yellow using their tree lines from their engineering drawings. Well, that tree line comes right out across here. And that's where they are getting into the forested wetland. This is standing on the south side looking north. Here are cherry trees, and this I maintain is upland, even though they call it a wetland. This is the wetland over here on this low bank of the stream. This is densely vegetated with skunk cabbage. Winter picture, so you don't see the actual skunk cabbage, but you could see them popping up all over the place in February a year ago when we were out there. This is looking at it, looking up the stream. We were looking before across this way at that slope. Once you're up here in the beech trees, you're out of the wetland. This is the wetland. There are not too many trees in here, you will notice, but what are there? They're overarching canopy. That is what the Callardin system tells you makes this a forested wetland. And we'll be arguing this in court in the next couple of months. Sunoco's consultant was testifying just the opposite in the supersedeas hearings last February. Another picture of the same thing. I mean, all you need is a 30% canopy closure to have a forest. Or if this were scrub, not full-size trees, a 30% canopy of trees to make.
30% canopy it defines it as a forest or a forested wetland?
It defines it as a forest.
Okay.
It says nothing about whether it's
Okay.
a wetland or not.
All right.
They're two distinct and specific definitions. And what has been testified here on behalf of Sunoco, and I think quite wrongly, is that if you take and make up a formal data sheet and record all the plants and record the colors of the soil and record the evidence of hydrology for this area right in here, you get all the skunk cabbage and all that stuff listed, you might say, well, here within my 30-foot sampling radius, I don't have a tree. So they're saying, well, then it can't be a forested wetland because you don't have any trees here. But that's not the relevant thing. You wouldn't list a tree here unless the tree were actually rooted and growing here as a part of this. But if the trees are coming over like this, then it's a forest. It's a matter of the structure. Now, let's jump west. This is Raystown Reservoir on a dam section of the Juniata River. It's just south of State College, so we've gone a long way west. There is a green line that comes across this drawing, and there's a little white polka dot line that goes right along with the green line. That little white polka dot line is the Mariner 1 East pipeline. And initially, the plan was to co-locate the Mariner 2 pipeline alongside the Mariner 1. They got into a problem here with Raystown Reservoir because they figured that they were going through a marina and across a wide part of the reservoir. They would have done this presumably by underground boring, so I don't see what the big issue was. But in any event, they decided instead of going this way, they would jump over because this purple line is the current Mariner 2, jump over to the existing Buckeye pipeline and come this way, coming east. For most of the way, they're following the Buckeye pipeline. Right here, this is low, you come up over a mountain, you go down in a valley here with the road in the middle and the stream in the middle, then you go up a mountain this way again, that's the crest of the mountain, and then you're going downhill again. So this is Ridge and Valley, Appalachia. Right here, they decided they would go off the Buckeye pipeline, and they've never given any rational explanation for why they did that. And the landowner right here objected to that, and she has had a fair amount of publicity in the news media for objecting to the condemnation of her land. And right now she's got a federal civil rights case pending and other litigation. Here's a blow up of just this area. My client's property was this. It's about 30 acres or so, and her house is right there. The pipeline company is coming this way underneath her farm pond, which is right here. From here, it's bored underneath the road and underneath the creek, and there's extensive wetlands out here along this creek. And then it comes out and goes back in the trench again. So there's a workspace here. Then it goes up the mountain, hits the top of the mountain, and comes back to the Buckeye Pipeline. This is a longer route than going straight through. It's also going off into, this is planted pine forest. This is mostly not planted, mixed hardwoods and some pine trees. So that's where they're proposing to do it. Now, when we have been looking, here's the topography of the site. The streams are coming this way. They come into this farm pond. They go through a little culvert here. There's a little bit of open stream. Then it goes another culvert under the road and into the Big Creek wetlands over here. We did some biology at these stream sampling stations. These are all permanent streams with a diverse macro invertebrate fauna. This is cold water fisheries trout stocking classification. It's not a high quality designation. So anyway, that's the general topography of the site. When we finished our delineation out here, we found that this was the wetlands right close to the corridor, because Sunoco had looked at this piece of it, and then they had looked at this piece of it, but you'd never know that there was any relation between the streams in this system. Permanent stream starts up here, and there was a little bit of extra wetland up here. So this was originally flagged by Sunoco, and I'll show you that in just a moment. In here, there was some wetlands originally flagged, and I think they probably were coming more like this, because this would have been out of their study corridor. I'm inferring why they did that. Up here, they missed the stream and the wetlands entirely, and they had this square workspace up to the corner going across the whole thing. Now, here is a drawing, as I showed you before. I've colored the forest green here from their ENS plan drawings based on their forest edge boundaries. So you've got the cleared existing pipeline down here. There's some houses out toward the road that way. But this is all forest. And this workspace is to be flattened out. This is a very steep slope. It's about a 45% slope going down that way. They're going to do this big fill here so that they can pull their pipes and stack their pipes here to do the boring. So that's what this big chunk is all about. And you will see that they have made the corridor workspace slightly narrower to go around the wetlands that they acknowledged as being wetlands. They didn't recognize anything like this as being a wetland along the stream, because they put up the signs that say water body crossing, but that's a wetland. It's not a huge wetland, but there's a linear wetland along that stream the whole distance. They call this PEM, again, an emergent herbaceous wetland, and that looks like a forest to me. I don't know if it looks like a forest to anybody else, but I don't think you need an expert to tell you that that's a forest. Okay, so that was that one. I can just total up some numbers from that site. That pipeline was crossing almost a third of a mile of the Gerhardt property, 1,485 linear feet. That's 9/100ths of 1% of the entire pipeline. And Sunoco originally identified 27 1,000ths of an acre of wetland impact on the property. By the time we were done with the Corps of Engineers field inspection on our request for jurisdiction and stuff, the wetlands had increased by a factor of 3.3. So there were 3 times as many wetlands within the footprint of this pipeline on this one property than there were initially. Numbers-wise, it's not huge because that increase was from 39 thousandths of an acre up to 66 thousandths of an acre. But it's a lot more than there was percentage-wise to start with. So if you multiply that out with a kind of a 3 times factor, I can tell you what that amounted to for the whole pipeline. If I get the right numbers out of the hat here. We then, so it was about 2.5 times higher if we took what Sunoco agreed to, and if you took what we had flagged and documented, it was about 3 times as much. So instead of 30 acres, we're up to about 70 acres if you wanted to multiply that for the entire pipeline. Okay. We then looked a little further around here. We looked at 45 sheets of drawings. I have been showing you some of the ENS drawings. So we looked at 45 of them in Huntington County, right there next to Gerhardt, to see if there was something peculiar about this one landowner's property. And this was work done not on the field, but just from looking at what the delineations were and looking at the paperwork on it. We found that there were a total of 59 wetlands on those 45 sheets. Nearly 70% of them were characterized as herbaceous, 19% as forested, 12% as scrub. Well, the National Wetland Inventory for Huntington County, for what that's worth, has the proportions reversed, 72% forested wetlands, 7% scrub, and 13% herbaceous. So I think that it's not unique to Gerhardt's property. And if you look at that, all these numbers go up by an order of magnitude on the conversions, if you look at how much is mischaracterized. And again, that's mischaracterized by doing what I showed you. Look at the drawings carefully, see where the tree line is. And every place we have looked out in the field, the engineers have got the tree lines right. I think engineers do that because I use air photos all the time to figure out their cover for stormwater calculations. And it's the environmental consultants who don't know how to tell a forest from an herbaceous. I'm going to jump up to the Poconos now on the Leidy Southeast. This is the Lehigh River right here, and this is where existing pipeline goes across, and they're going to build another one here. This is right up in that area on this big Transco system. Here, slightly different drawings, but similarly, they have identified, here's the pipeline, here are the wetlands, and they've characterized the wetlands. Also, they had, because of where this is in the state, they had to go and do a bog turtle assessment of this area. A bog turtle assessment, because the bog turtle is a federally threatened and Pennsylvania endangered species. And when they did that, they came along and they surveyed this one, but they forgot this one. So, you know, this is just not very carefully done survey work. I can tell the difference between a forest and an emergent wetland with some shrubs in it. So this pond right along the existing pipeline, totally omitted from their inventory. Nice little pond. And I think this is happens to be in Nature Conservancy land up on the Pocono Plateau. This I put in just to comment. This is an existing pipeline corridor here, and they hadn't cleared that for a while, so they're getting pretty good forest growing back in it. Pipeline companies like to keep these clear because they can then fly over it with an airplane and see that nobody's building any buildings or stuff in their right of way, but they sometimes forget. Then there was some mitigation proposed for that, and this is getting toward the end of what I'm going to talk about. Those last few illustrations came from this line. This was the Leidy, Franklin Loop of the Leidy East Pipeline. There was another little loop over here in Luzerne County. This is the Susquehanna watershed. This is the Delaware watershed. And they were proposing to do mitigation for the wetlands that they were damaging here. Now this is quite a long ways away, and it's in a very different ecological system, if you will. I mean, this is way up in the Poconos. This is down south of Blue Mountain. So we're in a very different place. And what does that mitigation consist of? Well, here's the place that they were going to do their mitigation. Mitigation area is outlined in yellow. This is obviously a farming area. There's only a scrap of woodlands here and there around the streams. And in fact, there is very little woodland around these streams because the farm fields come right up to the edge of the top of the bank. That's where they're going to do their mitigation. And what are they going to do? Well, they're going to come and plant some trees in this existing wetland. And I guess that wouldn't hurt anything, but I don't know that that accomplishes a great deal ecologically. This is a high quality watershed, and if you had a 150-foot setback from the streams in a buffer, you'd be all the way out here to the road. But they were only going to do something right along that little edge. What else? Yeah, well, those are the kinds of things that are proposed to be done. So if you undercount the wetlands, you mischaracterize the wetlands, and then you plan to do some mitigation that's iffy at best, that's what you get in the pipeline construction in Pennsylvania. It's not very assuring to me as a member of the public and somebody who would like to see a bit of environmental preservation going on across the Commonwealth. Our Department of Environmental Protection has a budget that is less than half of what it was 10 years ago. They have very severe shortages of staff and a lot of workload from the fracking well inspections and things to try to take care of. So there's not a lot of manpower out to look at things like wetland delineations along proposed pipeline routes. And we can do some of that just from studying carefully the drawings that they produce and doing spot checking, such as we have done out along the roads and in the public lands through which the routes pass. But I'm not too sanguine about how well all this is going to go. Things could be done a lot better. And I think that the forests are suffering greatly, because it would take a long time to restore a wetland forest, but the pipelines are not doing that. They're not proposing to do that. And they're not proposing to restore the upland forests, except in some cases along stream buffers, along riparians. They are proposing to replant some of those, and they were shown on some of those drawings, which I didn't dwell on. But they're not in uplands in general, outside the immediate stream banks. So that's what's happening in our landscape with pipelines. The process can be made to work properly. It can also be abused, because if you have the wrong people doing the reviewing, you're not going to get anything better than you had to start with. So, you know, it's like anything else. A process is only as good as the implementation and the people that are doing the work. So that's my comments from the nuts and bolts of the permit process.
Thank you very much.